There are no good wars, but the conflict in Ukraine is the very worst kind, the type of attritional warfare the continent of Europe believed it had left behind long ago. From World War I style trench warfare along the battlefronts to the daily toll of missile, drone and artillery strikes on Ukraine's civilian communities. And after almost 3 years, that relentless bloody slog continues to grind on. The cost on both sides has been massive. Western military intelligence believes Russia alone has suffered more than 700,000 casualties. Recent months have been some of the bloodiest, with estimates that Russia has been losing an average of 1,500 troops each day, either injured or killed. The Ukrainian government won't publish the number of its troops killed or injured, but the civilian death toll is measured in the tens of thousands. Ukraine's Western allies are regularly seen indulging in a spot of mutual backslapping, congratulating each other at summits or occasional visits to Kyiv, proclaiming their steadfast support for the embattled nation. But in truth, Ukraine's political and military leaders feel they've been made to fight throughout with one hand tied behind their back. They're right. At every step of the way since Russia's invasion, Ukraine's desperate calls for military support for different weapons systems have been met with prevarication and delay. We saw it first with heavy artillery, then tanks, fast jets, and now long-range missiles. Many months pass of debate and discussion before Ukraine eventually gets the systems they so desperately need. Not enough to make a decisive difference on the battlefield, but just enough to keep them in the fight. It seems cruel and counterintuitive. If you really support Ukraine, why not give them everything they need in a timely manner to start making a real difference on the front line? Major General Tim Cross, you were one of the British Army's most senior logistics officers, in charge indeed of logistics entirely for defence in your latter years. Can you understand Ukraine's frustration here, the feeling that they're being made to fight with one hand tied behind their back?
Yes, I can. I mean, undoubtedly, it has been the case. One of the famous maxims, of course, is that amateurs discuss tactics, professionals discuss logistics. At the end of the day, notwithstanding the courage and the bravery of the people who have to fight in the front line, most campaigns are decided by rear battles and deep battles. The ability to strike deep into enemy territory, disrupting their logistics and their lines of communication and so on, and to sustain your own rear area, delivering the materiel in the round, combat supplies, ammunition, fuel, food, and dealing with casualties and so on and so forth, equipments, repairing them, and bringing stuff out of the front line and sending new stuff in. That's the heartbeat of winning a campaign. And there's no doubt that Ukraine has found itself in a situation where, you know, it's been engaged in some very deep and serious close battles. It's taken serious casualties. But if you're going to sustain that fight, you need a constant flow of material to enable you to do that. And they have struggled, I think, to maintain that flow.
Well, why do you think, though, that Ukraine's leaders have struggled here and have had to fight this constant diplomatic battle to get what their troops desperately need on the front line?
Well, of course, to begin with, they didn't have the capability themselves. I mean, that's a lesson for every country that, you know, war comes unexpectedly. And if you haven't got the depth of resources and material, the ammunition stocks and the vehicles and men and equipment trained and ready to fight, then you're going to struggle. In Ukraine's case, they have heavily relied on we, the West, in inverted commas, to help them to replace and replenish those stocks as the fighting has continued. And, there's been a reluctance within NATO as a whole, concern about escalating the problem. Should they engage in the first place? How would Russia react to NATO engagement? What should it look like, etc.? But every time Ukraine has asked for a particular piece of equipment or the ability to strike deep or to maintain some of this capability, the West have taken a long time before they've actually then in the end provided it. The latest example of this is, of course, the ability to strike deep, which I've touched on a couple of times, using things like ATACMS and Storm Shadow and so forth. Now, if that had been agreed months, if not a couple of years ago, it could have made significant difference. I suspect, frankly, it's going to make little difference in the context of where we stand today. But, that's just an example of it.
As you say, in terms of where we stand today, it might make little difference. But do you think if Ukraine had got some of the systems that it so desperately needed much sooner, that it could have been able to prevail, that the situation on the ground would be or could be quite different to how it's looking today?
Well, in one sense, of course, it's impossible to say. And I don't know what the difference it would have made. But if we look back over the period, the delivery of, for example, main battle tanks, the ability to deliver air capabilities and so on that took a long time to be agreed, would that have meant that Ukraine could have defended the Donbass, for example, better, lost less ground? Well, clearly, if you've got greater combat power and fighting power, then they may well have been able to hold that ground better and not cede it to the Russians. So, and I speak clearly, I speak as a military man here. I'm not naive. I understand the political conversations. I understand the concerns that politicians have over escalating this issue and so forth, all those other issues. But from a purely military point of view, the delay in delivering those sorts of capabilities over the last couple of years undoubtedly would have made a difference on the battlefield.
Perhaps the UK, more than most countries, can hold its head up when it comes to Ukraine. Following Russia's invasion and annexation of Crimea in 2014 and its de facto takeover of parts of the Donbass in eastern Ukraine, the UK was already arming and training Ukrainian forces. And after Putin sent his troops in en masse in 2022, Britain was front and centre of efforts to persuade other countries to step up their support. The then British Prime Minister Boris Johnson was the first major Western leader to visit Kyiv after the invasion, as the capital was still under significant threat of attack. And throughout this almost 3-year-long war, the UK was first to supply anti-tank missiles in the face of some opposition. It was first to supply its Challenger tanks, which forced the hand of other nations like Germany, Poland and the US to provide the Ukrainians with their tanks. The US in particular felt bounced into agreeing that fast jets could be supplied to Ukraine after Britain began training Ukrainian pilots in fast jet operations. And most recently, it was the UK that pressed hard for the US to allow Ukraine to use Western-supplied long-range missiles on Russian soil.
I think what happened prior to the invasion, and people like the previous Secretary of State for Defence, Ben Wallace, and indeed, what everyone thinks of him, Boris Johnson and others, were very proactive in those early days. And to be fair, again, the current government, the current Prime Minister has made it quite clear that he wishes to maintain that ability. And we've given a lot of stuff to Ukraine. America clearly has been the major player, and other nations like Germany have finally, moved in to provide. But I do think we can hold our heads up high. The problem is, in inverted commas today, and I take the comments by the Prime Minister in the last 48 hours, we want to support Ukraine in order that they win. Well, how do we define winning where we stand today? Looking back to the previous couple of years, we could have defined winning in all sorts of ways. But the chances today of Ukraine recapturing the Crimea or retaking the lost territories in the Donbass, I think, frankly, are pretty slim. I think Ukraine has been losing slowly over the period we're talking about here. But I do think your point is important. Britain has played a key role in this, and as a consequence, frankly, we have depleted our own stocks, which we need to think seriously about replacing pretty quickly.
Now, it could be argued that Russia's invasion was a kick in the backside, that Western leaders needed to start taking defence seriously again, and that Nato has actually been renewed and strengthened as a result. But as much as that's probably true, doesn't it also expose the weaknesses of a military alliance of many different countries where some leaders unlike, for instance, UK leaders, are clearly far more cautious, some downright lukewarm in their support of Ukraine.
Yes, it does. I think that's a fair comment. I mean, one must say straight away that countries like Poland, for example, are now spending 4% of GDP on their defence. They've taken it obviously particularly seriously, and has indeed have the Baltic states. Now, they're the ones hard up against the Russian border, so in that sense, one can understand that. But over the, when one looks back at NATO over the last couple of decades, really, the commitment to spend at least 2% of GDP on defence is one that many countries did meet until relatively recently, and some are still working towards that limit. The numbers who are now spending 2% is much greater than it was, but there are still some serious players who are behind that figure, and they need to, need to maintain that momentum.
In the dying days of the Biden presidency, Ukraine has finally been given permission to use US-supplied long-range missiles on Russian soil. But once again, with limitations, they can only be used in Russia's Kursk region, where Ukraine is fighting a Russian counter-offensive to take back territory Ukraine now controls after an incursion into Russia in recent months. The US has also agreed that Ukraine can use anti-personnel mines within Ukrainian territory, something Kyiv has been calling for a very long time. I'm not big on conspiracy theories, but I find it increasingly difficult to argue against those who claim NATO leaders never really wanted a quick and decisive end to the war in Ukraine. That for them, the better outcome has been a deep attritional war, which has tied Russia down for years, vastly depleting its military capabilities and reducing the threat it poses to the wider world.
It's certainly an argument I've heard, and to be fair, on the one hand, many would say that Ukraine has been fighting Russia on our collective behalf and depleting the Russian capability of sustaining operations elsewhere against NATO, particularly in places like the Baltic states. And what they've exposed is that Russia's not been doing particularly well. Now, I have to say, I'm a chaos, not a conspiracy man. My experiences over 40 years in the military in various deployments around the world, chaos is really what I've seen. And I see that not just in a military sense, but in a broader political sense as well, with decision makers struggling to decide what to do. All choices carry consequences. One of my mantras in life, really. The decision not to go on into Baghdad in the first Gulf War carried serious consequences with it. And the uncertainty over that, and difficulty of making decisions, and so on. So, I am a chaos man, and I don't think early on people deliberately sat down and said, "Okay, how can we make this thing last 2 or 3 or 4 years?" Nobody believed in those early months that it was going to last this long. So, whilst it is true that Ukraine has been fighting on our collective behalf, I don't think anybody deliberately sat down to try to make that happen, frankly.
Why do you think the US has finally relented and allowed Ukraine the use of its long-range missiles to attack Russian territory, albeit in a limited way?
Well, I think the honest truth, of course, is that I don't know, really, but I suspect there's a couple of issues. One, President Biden has been, pretty supportive of Ukraine and is now in his last few weeks of his tenure as president. And therefore, I think he wanted to throw a couple of rolls of the dice in order to give them some of the stuff that they have been asking for quite a while. But alongside that, obviously, President-elect Trump has said that he thinks he can bring this thing to an end pretty quickly. I mean, whether one believes that to be the case or not, but if it is the case, then you want Ukraine to end up in the strongest position it possibly can in order to be able to attend the negotiations from a position of strength. Now, does that mean that they can push back further into the Donbass? Does it mean they can hold the salient in the Kursk for longer? It certainly means they can strike, going back to something we were saying at the beginning, strike deep into Russian territory and cause significant damage to their logistics, their lines of communication, artillery, command and control centers, etc. And so it would put Ukraine in a better position so that if Trump were to come into power and then immediately try to bring both sides to the negotiating table, at least they're sitting on that table from a relative position of strength.
Add to the mix the impending Donald Trump presidency, and these are deeply worrying and uncertain times for Ukraine. President-elect Trump has boasted he can end the war in 24 hours. But what would that mean for Ukraine? Negotiations that would almost certainly result in them losing the territory already seized, either directly to the Russians or under the stewardship of peacekeepers under some form of autonomy. In the meantime, Ukraine's allies are continuing with their support for the embattled nation. Here, on an army training ground in the east of England, the latest batch of Ukrainian troops are being put through their paces. The UK has now trained some 50,000 Ukrainian troops over the past 2.5 years. 12 other nations are now also involved in offering training to Ukrainian personnel. The UK and several other countries have committed to Ukraine's long-term security. But can they really go it alone if the US withdraws its support?
That's a really important question. And, when we've got, our own Prime Minister saying that we want to ensure that Ukraine will win, all these leaders have been saying throughout this whole period that they will not, it is Ukraine's decision as to how they see this thing, come to an end. And if they're serious about that, and, one can have a conversation about how robust and resilient they would be about that, I don't think Trump would pull out of supporting Ukraine completely, any more than I think Trump will pull out of Nato completely. But yeah, he could potentially reduce the size and shape and scale of what America is providing to Ukraine. Now, that has an impact in terms of US defense industry and so on. But the question you rightly pose is Europe capable of stepping into the gap? My own view at the moment is no, unless they are prepared, and our own country is prepared to increase defence spending and ramp up our production and capabilities. That is not going to happen overnight. That will, even if the decision was taken today, it would take several months, if not a year or so, to increase that. So, I think you come back to, is the political intent strong enough to say, yes, okay, we will fill the gap, and then do we have then the capabilities to do that sufficiently quickly that allows Ukraine to continue to hold out and then to engage in any offensive operations that they may wish to do next year.
Perhaps Donald Trump is exactly what's needed to bring an end to the misery inflicted by this protracted conflict. NATO has certainly benefited with an emboldened alliance ever since the invasion and a vastly weakened Russia. But for Ukraine, any resolution is likely to be hard to swallow if Russia is allowed to keep territory it seized. But that may well be the price they have to pay for an end to a war that has ravaged this country for so long.